So, last week I talked about photography on winter days when you don't feel like it. So, today we're going to talk a little bit more on the specifics and exactly how I like to take photos on dull, grey winter days like this. So as you can see from today's footage and as I mentioned in last week's video, it's winter here in Germany. Now I know winter is different everywhere, but for most of my life, winter hasn't meant beautiful, white, snowy weather. It's meant wind, rain, and most of all, a lot of dull, grey days. Growing up in Ireland, this is certainly the case. And here in Cologne, well, yeah, it's a little bit better, but unfortunately it's still the case. Now, before I used to be very frustrated by this type of weather for many reasons, but most of all for photography. And mostly because I struggled with it a lot. I just found it really, really boring and I could never find ideas on what to shoot on days like this. I always figured that my photos were just bound to be boring on days like this and there was nothing that I could really do with this type of light. And of course, as is kind of a theme with this channel, I was wrong. And over the years, I've developed my style and photography to the point where actually now I really like this type of weather. On days like this, the light is often dull, but it's diffused and balanced. The weather can be really atmospheric and really cool if you know where to look. But more than anything now, after all this time, I now know that it's possible to find a good photo anywhere, no matter what the conditions are. So let's talk about how. Sometimes the best thing about this type of weather is, well, it's exactly that. It's the weather. Dull, rainy, boring days like this are exactly the type of days where you'd be more likely to find most of us at home editing than you would be out shooting. But something I always try to push myself to do, especially recently, is to try and actually go out and shoot on days like this when you don't feel like it. I think we all know it deep down, but rainy day photography can actually be really cool and it can be really easy to get a good photo on days like this. Rain and weather and atmospheric conditions are often exactly the thing you need to make your photograph stand out and be a little different. Light rain, fog, mist, even just wind. All of these can be elements that you can use to make an interesting photo. Bad weather and days like this also cause people and your surroundings to behave differently too. And if you're out shooting street or travel photography, for example, this is great. People might have umbrellas, which usually brings a pop of color or something interesting, or they might be running to avoid the rain. Wet weather might cause reflections on the ground. All of this can make your photo a little bit more interesting. All you have to do is change your perspective on how you view it, and the weather can tell a story on its own. Of course, the footnote here is to be careful with your camera gear. I find that most weather sealed gear can take like a decent bit of weather exposure these days, but it's always good to be careful. I got hit with lens fungus once and that really wasn't fun. So know your gear and how weather sealed it is. You can always use a rain cover over your camera too if it's really wet. I usually use something like a sandwich bag as a DIY cover. It works great. Dull grey light on winter days like this can also make for really stable shooting conditions. Sometimes in other conditions the light can change really fast and we have to be very quick to get the type of photo that we want to get. But on these dull grey days things usually don't change so much and it's all pretty consistent. So I find for myself that it's a great time to experiment with different techniques and maybe practice some things that you mightn't practice on a day where the light is really, really good and you really need to get the shot that you want to get. If you have lots of time, you can try and fail and there's less pressure on yourself as well. So practicing and experimenting on different things is both fun and can also lead to great photos. So what are the things that I like to experiment with? Dull weather can really emphasize different textures and surfaces, so it can be fun to try and find different ways to emphasize this. This type of weather usually brings diffused, soft light, and that eliminates the contrasts between light and shadows on different surfaces. So a lot of the textures around us are uniformly lit, and it can be really nice to try and show and find these. I think I've surely mentioned this before in one of my videos, but motion blur is a technique that I love to drop into my photos every now and then. And it can be a really great way to amplify your photos on days with dull or boring light. I find that it can really give my photography a boost of energy when I might not be getting it from the light around me. To do this, I usually reduce my shutter speed to at least 1/15 of a second, but that might be slower or faster depending on the specific conditions that I'm shooting in. If you have an ND filter, this can also help you keep your settings in line, but it might not be necessary on dull or darker days. I find on darker days there's often a little extra ambient light that you can find around, and experimenting with this can be a great way to make your photos stand out. Some of the photographers that I love are absolute masters at this. Things like traffic lights, street lamps, car lights, they can all add a little bit of extra interest to your photo. Of course, in the winter you can also make use of the shorter days, get out in the morning or in the evening for some blue hour, maybe even try your hand at some nighttime photography. And of course, my advice for almost all types of photography, and it's no different on dull, grey days like this, that's to focus on the story. What's the story that you want to tell? I know it's a little bit cliche at this point, but honestly, I say this for a reason. Best media that I see around these days is always centered around a good story. It's really as simple as that. And for me, it's the best way to have fun and enjoy my own photography, especially on days like this. If the weather is dull and grey, just ask yourself, what's the story that I want to tell here? And just have fun telling that story. And hopefully my tips in this video can help you do that a little bit better, but really that's all there is to it. If there's a story, your photos will never be boring. Thanks for watching, I'll see you soon.